Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Rising sea levels, stronger storms, eroding shorelines, and sinking terrain are all taking a toll on the fragile ecosystems and historic resources at Cape Lookout National Seashore in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. A new study by the U.S. Geological Survey takes a close look at these threats and predicts how they will impact the National Seashore over the coming years. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Climate change impacts are happening across the country, reaching into most, if not all, units of the national park system. Sea level rise is particularly concerning because you just can't up and move a park, and if that park is on an island, well, high water is coming. This week, the Traveler's Lynn Riddick talks with Cape Lookout Superintendent Jeff West and authors of the USGS study about the challenges the National Park Service faces in creating sustainable coastal management practices for Cape Lookout. We'll be back in a minute with Lynn and her guests.
Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Today I am talking with three folks very familiar with the threats facing Cape Lookout National Seashore. Among those threats are rising sea levels, more intense storms, and shrinking shorelines. Jeff West, Superintendent at Cape Lookout National Seashore on North Carolina's southern Outer Banks, and authors of the study, Jenny Thomas, oceanographer, and Patrick Barnard, research geologist, at the Pacific Coastal and Marine Science Center of the U.S. Geological Survey in Santa Cruz, California. They all agree that there's an urgent need for long-term planning and adaptive management to mitigate the hazards facing this particular barrier island and others. Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Traveler.
Good morning, Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi, everyone. Before we get into the findings of the new study by the U.S. Geological Survey and its predictions on the imminent threats to Cape Lookout, I'd like Jeff to describe the National Seashore for us. It's a unique but fragile place, isn't it?
Unique and fragile and tough all at the same time. It's quite the combination. Let's see, today at this tide, we're probably about 57 miles long, somewhere in that neighborhood, but we've got three main islands most of the time. Sometimes there's a few more than that, but most of the time, three main islands, North Core Banks, South Core Banks, and Shackelford Banks. It is a barrier island. On one side of it is a sound area between us and the mainland. On the other side is the open ocean. It is subject to anything the maritime environment can throw at it.
And talk a little bit about the historic significance of the seashore.
So we have one of the oldest towns in North Carolina, Portsmouth. It was founded in 1753, and it was a port that opened up many of the areas inland. New Bern, Washington, Elizabeth City, all the places that were major ports back when North Carolina was a colony actually had to have their stuff come through Portsmouth. It was one of the largest towns, well, it was the largest town for a long time on the Outer Banks. We also have Cape Village on the southern end, which is home to the Cape Lookout Lighthouse. First lighthouse was built there in 1812, and the one that stands today was built in 1859. It's got a lot of historic significance. Coast Guard stations were located in both of the towns, so long tie-ins to maritime history and the culture of the region. Almost every family in Carteret County that has been here for a long time can trace their roots back to Portsmouth.
And yet, Portsmouth Village, no one is living there anymore, hasn't for years, correct?
Nobody that we know of. No, no, it's right now, a lot of people call it a ghost town. We like to think of it as a living, thriving cultural heritage center of history, because you can go there and get a sense out of what it was really like to live on the Outer Banks before we had all the modern day conveniences that we have today, because they're certainly already out there now.
Now, Jeff, you and I had a conversation 4 years ago about the loss and damage that the historic structures and cemeteries on Portsmouth Island and Harker's Island after Hurricane Dorian in 2019. That was podcast number 97, if anybody wants to go back and listen to it. So, Jeff, if you would summarize for us the loss that occurred there.
Lynn, I even still hate talking about it today. It was absolutely devastating. It wasn't anything that we shouldn't have practically expected, but after you have spent time and effort and money and poured blood, sweat, and tears into, restoring and maintaining an area, and you've delved into the history of it, people who actually lived there. The families that are tied to the place. It was hard to go out there after Dorian and see every single structure that we had out there damaged or destroyed. And it was financially, I didn't know how we were ever going to address it. Practically, I didn't know how we were going to address it, but we have over the years. We've gotten things reconstructed out there, repaired, rehabilitated, or removed if they were too far gone. But it wasn't just, the historic village of Portsmouth. It sits on the north end of North Core Banks, and the entirety of North Core Banks was impacted by that Soundside event as it came back across the banks. It was awe-inspiring and devastating to go out there that day after the storm and see what had happened. It was amazing. We had no concept of what we were going to see. Now, certainly, we visualized damage to buildings and flooding and stuff like that, kind of things that you expect after a hurricane. But we didn't expect the island to be sliced and diced. There's lots of numbers flowing around out there. When we were out there, we were counting every stream that cut across the island as a cut through. I think they ended up classifying it as 54 major cut throughs out there, but the island was just sliced up. And that same amount of water, had come across Portsmouth on its way. Of course, our sister park to the north at Ocracoke, they were devastated by that same storm. So it was very impactful.
Now, as far as the historic structures, like you mentioned, the Park Service was able to restore and stabilize all but two that were damaged during the hurricane. And you have said that a strong nor'easter can do as much or more damage as a hurricane, and they can come more frequently. So, have any nor'easters done any more damage to the island or historic structures since we spoke 4 years ago? And if so, was some of the damage mitigated because of some of the stabilizing efforts that you had undertaken?
At Portsmouth itself, the way it's situated, it is more protected from the nor'easters with the exception of the wind part. As far as the waves and the currents, it's more protected sitting where it is. We have had some minor structural damage, but putting a solid roof, replacing an entire roof as opposed to piecemealing on there makes a huge difference with regard to how the roof can handle a storm. As far as North Core Banks, we have seen erosion. One of the cut throughs that occurred during Hurricane Dorian has remained, and right now we believe that mostly that's because of the storms that we've seen post Dorian and where this cut through is located on the north end of North Core Banks. So the erosion continues, the impacts continues. We've got almost no beach left now in front of where the Long Point cabins used to be, the rental cabins there on North Core Banks. So that's an ongoing process.
This new U.S. Geological Survey report outlines the exposure at Cape Lookout and what can be expected in the coming years in various categories related to flooding, groundwater depth, shoreline change, and vertical land motion. And the findings are dramatic. Jenny and Patrick, how did the study come about?
Well, there was a Disaster Relief Act in the wake of Hurricane Florence, actually. And so we got some funding for that. And then just so happened that Hurricane Dorian came along. So there's even a larger reason to look at the hazards affecting North and South Carolina. And so we had an opportunity to build out a modeling system called Cosmos, Coastal Storm Modeling System, which looks at the impact of sea level rise and storms on coastal communities and assets. And so that was part of the broader study. And then talking with Jeff and Dave Halleck and others with NPS, we saw an opportunity to work with Park Service to basically do a finer tuned study focusing on the seashore.
So let's break down the four areas that the study addresses and what your conclusions are. The first is flooding. So explain, you mentioned Cosmos, explain the measuring and the data collection process and what the report found.
Yeah, we ran the model for a series of different sea level rise scenarios and storm intensities to see what the flooding would be for those different scenarios. And they're all scenarios that could potentially occur within the next century. For example, with approximately 1.5 feet of sea level rise, the model would project that about half of the current land area would be covered in water always. Then in addition to that, you'd have the storms occurring, causing additional flooding. So each year you could have a storm that could cover an additional 27% of the area. And then, of course, storms can be more powerful and cause more flooding, as evidenced by storms like Hurricane Dorian.
So the report talks about 1-year return period storm and 20-year return period storm. Explain those exactly.
Sure, it's a little complicated, but I think one way to understand it would be the 1-year return period storm is basically a storm intensity that you would expect to see every year. And a 20-year storm is one that is so intense that it would only occur every 20 years. And then for the 100-year, same idea, it's so intense that you'd only expect it to occur every 100 years. And so each one more intense than the previous.
So, for example, the 20-year return period storm, cited in your study would be projected to cover 85%, like the flooding would cover 85% of the current landmass?
I believe that was the value. I'd have to double check, but that sounds right to me.
It's pretty amazing. What was the most surprising when you looked at the data regarding the flooding?
That's a great question. I don't know if it was so surprising, but just the fact that even at current sea levels, 20-year and 100-year storms cause such extensive flooding. And, of course, as sea level rises, that becomes worse. But yeah, even in present day sea levels, it can be over 85% of the land area.
And Jeff, as comparison, Hurricane Dorian and Portsmouth Village, how much would you say was covered with flooding during that big storm?
85% plus. It's interesting too because you look at, I should probably shut up, let the scientists talk about this, but I can't help myself. This is such an impactful thing to me. But, when you look at Dorian, if you just looked at the storm, a Cat 1 storm that really didn't even come aground here, not any big deal. We should have been fine, right? But it was the angle, the timing, and the way that storm moved water that made all the difference. If it had hit us direct, it might have been better than it was. If it hit us when, tide was out, it definitely would have been better than it was. But the timing of it, the angle of it were just right for us to end up having a major impact from what really, typically is not a bad storm for us.
So, did the USGS integrate any historical data or previously done climate models in projecting the future risks of flooding and effect of flooding on this coastal area?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely use historical data to test the models. We want to make sure that they're actually functioning for historical storms like Florence, for example, and like Dorian, where there were lots of observations as well. So it's really important that everything is data driven and strenuously tested and validated. So we can't predict the past correctly, then we're certainly not going to have a lot of confidence in the future. So we find as much available observations as we can, whether they're tide data, water level data, wave data, all those different physical processes that drive flooding. So that's a critical part of the whole process is to tune that model so it's working really, really well, and we can do a nice prediction of historical events.
And Jeff, you mentioned the Hurricane Dorian flooding. What other anecdotal evidence do you see there regarding flooding on a daily basis? I know you previously had talked about how regular flooding sort of eliminated a lot of the lawn grass at Portsmouth Village, and instead, three types of marsh grasses are now growing where regular lawn grass was growing. And that's an indication of the flooding and the introduction of seawater into that area.
Yeah, we decided that was a big clue that things were not the same when the marsh grass was located in the St. Augustine, and in fact is taken over in much of Portsmouth proper. But so it's an interesting thing about observations, right? We make observations, we see things happening, and whoa, this is new. This is something. And then it happens so often you forget that it's new. The king tide, the extreme lunar tides that we've been experiencing in recent years are one of those things. We never had lost days of work at Portsmouth due to flooding, except during a storm. Now we, on average, have about 12 days a year that we can't work out there because everything is flooded. In fact, we will go out there some days and discover that the main dock for Portsmouth, all over dock, is underwater. Got alternatives to that, but what kind of alternative do you have when everything else where the houses are is covered in water? Now they're elevated right now to keep them out of water during those extreme tide events, but everything else is underwater. And the last thing you want to do is drive off into the marsh, on a road you can't see anymore. So that's something that we see now. It's becoming more common, but it's also something you can get used to and work around and forget it's happening because it just didn't used to happen. And that's one of the things that we're seeing. Another thing that we're seeing out there is the die off of the trees. After the storms, we always have some trees we have to cut that were damaged by storms. In this case, we are seeing not just a tree or two, but literally hundreds of trees that are dying off out there. Not too long ago, we went out there and just had to take down a bunch of these standing dead trees. Some of them were just too close to the house, but they were all dead. And we ended up taking down about 625 trees.
Wow.
Yeah, almost everything around the structures at Portsmouth, and in the visitor use area. And the real catcher of that is to look back at pictures from 1985 when the Park Service literally tunneled through the trees and the shrubbery out there to get to these houses to do work on them. The difference is phenomenal, and it doesn't have to do with anything other than the fact that those trees aren't getting the fresh water they used to get.
It's really amazing to consider that so many trees were at once growing on that
But
that
again, it's
land.
something that we've gotten used to, right? As we take the trees down and move them out, well, okay, this is the way it is. And you get used to it after a while. You do not realize the change that the environment has had unless you look at surrounding areas where we don't have visitors and historic structures. And you glance over there and you say, wow, all those trees in the woods over there, they're dead. And you're thinking, huh. And then it reminds you of what we've done at Portsmouth, right? So it's one of those things you can become so accustomed to the change that you see occurring to you that it no longer is change. It's just, oh yeah, that's that way.
And I think it's important to point out again just how difficult it is to access this national seashore. So to get there and cut down trees and remove trees and maintain structures and repair structures is an enormous undertaking on the best of days.
It is. I mean, crews start, they arrive at Cedar Island at 7 o'clock in the morning, so they can get on the workboat that runs up there. It takes about 40 minutes to get up there. Once you get up there, because of the nature of Portsmouth, you got to go another mile or so to get to where we store all of our tools and equipment and stuff, and bring that out, do the work. And if you don't have a tool or a screw or a nail or whatever it is you need on Portsmouth, that is just too bad because it is a long way to get anything. You just don't run to the hardware store. We've got Ocracoke, but that's a 20-minute boat ride to run over there, and then we've still got to get to a store once we get over there if we need something. So yeah, it's logistically challenging. It's not impossible at all. People have been doing it for a long time, and the crews that we have out there are very accustomed to, working with things that they've got and making things work. But it is challenging.
So, Jenny and Patrick, the second area of the study was about groundwater depth. So, why is groundwater depth important on an uninhabited barrier island? And what can you tell us about groundwater depth currently and what the study shows?
Actually, I think the stuff Jeff was saying about the trees is a really good segue to the groundwater because I don't know this for sure, but he said they're not getting access to fresh water. And to me, that would be indicative that something's changing in the groundwater potentially. So yeah, as sea level rises, the saltwater tends to intrude into the subsurface and it pushes the groundwater table upward. And so it could be that that's an area where groundwater that the roots originally had access to was fresh, and now there's seawater that has infiltrated into there and could be potentially pushing that upward. So yeah, that's one of the things we looked at in the study was the depth of that shallow groundwater. And I think another thing to bring up maybe is the horses that live on Shackleford banks. I've heard from another colleague of Jeff's that she's seen the horses digging in areas to reach that groundwater, that maybe she's seen that changing. So depending on the depth of the groundwater, it's going to change where plants and animals can access and whether or not that groundwater is fresh or saline. We didn't look at if it was fresh or saline, but we did look at the change in depth.
And so, to summarize the change in depth, then?
Sure, yeah. Kind of sticking with that about 1.5 feet of sea level rise, the deeper groundwater decreases by about a half in area from 6 kilometers squared to 3 kilometers squared in the model projections. And so that could be a big loss in accessible groundwater for plants, potentially.
And how does rain replenish groundwater?
A lot of these barriers have these like shallow aquifers where they have a freshwater system right near the surface. And oftentimes rainfall is how the only way these things are recharged when you don't have like a, basically sophisticated, channel system or whatever. So often you have these really shallow, narrow lenses of fresh water on these islands. And so they get replenished by rainfall. But you start having more and more overwash from storms as salt water starts to wash into these freshwater lenses. And then it takes quite a while for those to basically become fresh again. And so there's been a lot of studies on barriers and coral atolls, for example, showing that as sea level rises, you're going to have more and more salt water intruding both from underneath and also from over land. And so that it's a very sort of fragile ecosystem that is supported by these freshwater lenses on these barriers.
And Jeff, you were nodding. You have some thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, this is just a fascinating thing for me, and not being a scientist, but I grew up on a ranch, so we kind of did things by taste. I'm still there. We were out there puzzling over this one day, and we have several shallow water wells. It's how everybody used to get their water out on the banks. You could go down a couple of feet and have access to gallons and gallons of fresh water, 6 feet maybe at the most. So we've got several of those, and one of the problems that we had is kind of funny. Our UTVs that we use to get around out there, we got excessive rust going on. We always wash these things off, and everybody's like, "What are we going to do? What's going on here?" They just don't make them like they used to. And I was out there one day, and I was cleaning off the UTV, and this was a king tide day, and I thought, huh. And I sprayed a little of that water on my hand and tasted it. It was salt. I mean, it was almost like tasting ocean water. And I thought, well, spraying them down with salt water is probably not the best thing we could do. But to take it back to the environment, Jenny brought up the Shackelford Banks horses. A number of years ago, as we began looking at this, we decided we needed to get some water studies done on Shackelford Banks to understand how that was going to impact that horse herd that was out there. I mean, right now we're, in the 120 animal range on the entire herd. That's about 6 harems, sometimes 7, running around out there on Shackelford Banks. But how long will we have the fresh water to support them is the question that came up. And so we're right now in the process. USGS is involved with this, along with UNC, looking at our freshwater lenses in plural out there. Now, the Sue has actually noted. She's our wildlife biologist that is over the horses out there, Dr. Sue Stuska, and she has noted that they're digging to access water in places she's never seen them do it before. And she's been over there for over 20 years. She knows where the horses get the water. They've been very consistent for many years. But the indicator to her was that there's fresh water available in places there didn't used to be. However, what does that mean? Is the saltwater level forcing new freshwater lenses to pop up in different places? We don't know exactly what it means, but they're not using some of the old ones. So there we go. The fact that we've had so many die-offs on the trees, absolutely. Again, the old taste test, we've dug down 1.5 feet is all we've gone down just to check this. And as the water fills that, you can taste that water and it's salt. Not quite like ocean salt water, but you can definitely taste the salt water in it. So, all that's indicative, and how it's going to change how animals interact on the banks. That's a big question that's out there now. How we're going to develop water sources in some way for those horses on into the future that mimics natural, but maybe involves a deep water well. We don't know. But we've got to understand the need before we can ever address the problem into the future. So that's part of our we have gotten some great help from USGS on many different things, and it's part of the need for the research and the science to look at this so that we don't make missteps in trying to answer a problem, one that we don't have, or we answer incorrectly.
Well, next, shoreline change. We've talked a little bit about that. Isn't it the very nature of a barrier island to shift and change?
Absolutely.
Can you explain the importance that barrier islands have on protecting the mainland, in particular, North Carolina's mainland?
A barrier island is going to reduce the wave energy that would be able to reach the mainland. So it's going to buffer the storm impacts. It could potentially buffer it from some of the surge from a storm. So, yeah, it is kind of like that first line of defense for the mainland from a storm, potentially. Again, I guess sort of using Dorian as an example, it kind of depends on which way the storm hits you. We looked at how the shoreline location was changing or projected to change with sea level rise and storms. And we found that, not surprisingly, it's expected in general to retreat with sea level rise. If we look again at that kind of 1.5 feet of sea level rise approximately, if you look at sort of the average retreat levels across all of Cape Lookout, in the narrower island region, the retreat could be as much as 20 to 30% of that island width.
So you're saying that 20 to 30% of the island could no longer be there because the shrinking coastlines.
At least the shoreline position of it, yeah. That doesn't say what will happen on the sound side of the island. There will be other changes to the shapes and elevations from storms and sea level rise, but this is just looking at that shoreline position part of it.
Yeah, this is one of the most complex pieces of the equation to understand, and I sure do not understand it. I mean, that first question was great. The only thing that is consistent out here on the Outer Banks is change. That is the only thing you can expect to see every day. And for the shoreline is going to move. There's no question about that. It's how much and when exactly. We do get a consistent erosion rate in different places, and there are some places that actually accrete on our shoreline. As we see the level of the ocean increase over the years, that's going to change how that's going to impact. You can rationalize that in a way. Well, if the ocean comes up, obviously there's going to be less beach, right? But how is it going to actually move, and how is that sand going to move? There's another big thing, the wind. We think about the water impacts on the barrier islands. The wind moves sand 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And to measure how that sand accretes, where it ends up landing, does it stay there? That's a hard thing. Overwash, another thing that we as human beings who own, beach houses do not like, because overwash means that our house is not going to be where it used to be. But overwash for a barrier island is a great thing. If our sand bank continues to build, if we push that sand across the top of the island and it accretes out there in the marsh system or pre-marsh system, up on the dunes, wherever it ends up, that's great. One of the things that is maintaining our marshes on a higher level than inland marshes right now is the fact that our marsh elevation is higher than inland marshes. And it's because of that natural process of accretion flowing across. So our marshes are right now, anyway, better protected because of the natural barrier island action that goes on. Will it keep up with sea level rise is the big question. And I will not pretend. I've listened to ocean morphologists and ocean geologists argue on this for literally hours. So I'm not going to get into the debate. But right now, this very minute, I think it's pretty safe to say that we are keeping up for the most part with the forces that are occurring out there. The last 10 years or so, there used to be a nice straight line in sea level rise based on the Beaufort gauge. Have many years of it. But in the last 10 years or so, we've got this kind of bend in it now that's more elevated. So it's an increase. And the big cause of concern we have is, will our accretion rates actually keep up with the accelerated sea level rise rates? You know, the barrier islands have, for the most part, done a really good job at moving with, the forces that affect them, with very few, with only a few examples of them actually disappearing from the forces that impact them. But our islands right now have a huge sandbank, and they seem to be holding their own. The problem is that by anything that we can measure or understand right now, and this is my understanding, so you guys fix me if I'm way off here, the potential into the future is way less for them to keep up with the forces that are pushing them around. The storms that have been hitting other places, we've been fortunate since Dorian, but they are far more violent in odd ways than they have been in the past. So if the storm intensity is worse, if the storms are more frequent, and once again, that whole nasty thing about the timing and the angle they hit us at, you know, there's a terrible example in southern Louisiana, the Chandelier Islands. It was a group of barrier islands that was very similar to a lot of things that we see on the East Coast, homes on them and telephone posts and people living there and stuff like that. But they're gone now, with a few exceptions, some humps that are left in places. So could that happen? I'm not going to say no, it couldn't happen, but being cognizant of the things that we're seeing, the research that's done out there and the indicators that are out there, it gives us a heads up on what potentially, we have in our future.
Jenny and Patrick, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah,
Anything
fix my science, y'all.
yeah, anything you need to fix?
I thought that was great. It's a really important question of like, how is the morphology going to change? And then how is that going to impact where flooding can occur and the other processes? And we don't know the answer to that yet. But it's certainly an active area of science that I think lots of folks are working toward to be able to do projections of that. But it is a really complicated question to look at for sure.
We know sea level is rising, it's accelerating. The rate has roughly doubled since the end of the 20th century over the last decade or so. So it puts more pressure on these dynamic barrier systems. I mean, they've evolved for centuries and millennia. These barriers were many miles offshore thousands of years ago. So they do migrate. That's what they do. Eventually, though, they either weld to the coast or sea level is so rapid that they can't keep up and they drown. And so, right now we're getting close to 5 millimeters per year of sea level rise. And there's some loose consensus out there that once you get to about a centimeter per year, it's hard for marshes to keep up. It's hard for barriers to keep up. But it's to be determined. And if you have more frequent storms, that's a factor. If you have less frequent storms, that's a factor. Where your sand comes from, these are all complicating issues that are challenges, which, Jeff is facing on the front lines of how you deal with all these things and how do you manage a national seashore where you're sort of doubly tasked with preserving cultural resources, but also trying to let nature do its thing. It's a great challenge. It's one of the wonderful reasons to work with Jeff is he's on the front lines dealing with these issues, and it's where the rubber meets the road. It's not theoretical, it's real life. And so Jeff provides incredible insight. And so it's a pleasure to work with him.
Yeah.
Finally, your report shows that the barrier islands of Cape Lookout are actually sinking, indicating increased erosion and habitat loss. So tell us about this and what the study predicts for the future.
I think there's several geological processes that affect the vertical land motion, how the land elevation is changing. And as you said, Cape Lookout is sinking. And this is based on satellite observations. So it's derived from satellites showing that Cape Lookout is sinking. The southernmost area, it increases in sinking rate the further south you go. So the south portion is sinking the fastest. And the issue with that is that it can exacerbate the other hazards that we looked at, and it can change the timing of them. So, if you're looking at relative sea level rise, that's going to change based on the land elevation changing.
So we talked about the wild horses. Jeff, can you describe some of the other animal, bird, and aquatic diversity that is there and how these changes will threaten them? Of course, obvious ways if groundwater and fresh water is unavailable. When I was there years ago, I remember a spot that had, seemingly thousands of pelicans roosting. And I just wanted to know your thoughts, or maybe tell us a little bit about what else, what other wildlife is there that we really need to pay attention to.
Well, unfortunately, it's also the resting place for many threatened and endangered species, and piping plovers, for instance, come here to lay eggs, and the habitat is wonderful for them. Oyster catchers, just a number of birds, and don't let me forget the turtles. It's usual for us to have over 400 turtle nests along the seashore a year. So how storms, overwash, sea level rise impact them is tremendous. Um, every year we lose a lot of nests to king tides, for instance. I guess the birds have not quite caught up with the concept of an extreme lunar tide. They nest where they nest. And now a lot of times those extreme lunar tides will actually overwash some of this habitat that they use all the time. Turtle nests are the same way. It's been fascinating to look at how turtles nest out here. Usually the top, they'll go up about 3/4 of the beach before they get to the dune line and nest. And most of their long history, that's been fine. They didn't have to worry about nests being inundated for too long. One tide or two tides rolling over the nest, probably not going to impact them. But when it gets up there and stays up there for a week, yeah, that's going to impact them. Nests are gone just like that. I mean, instantly. So you get the nesting areas inundated, and they're just gone. So, and I'm not talking about your average laughing gull. There are plenty of them. We all understand that. Anybody who's tried to open or have some popcorn on the beach knows the gulls are plentiful. But we're talking about the threatened and endangered species here that are, I mean, their habitat is being impacted significantly. Some of that we can have a little bit of impact on. We can, if we find the turtle nest in a timely fashion, we can we can move that nest to higher ground, to a better location where we're pretty sure it won't get overwashed. Takes a lot of time and effort to do that. It has to be done just right, and it has to be done in a timely fashion. So it's not always practical. And storms, you can't go and move 400 turtle nests before a storm if you even had a place to put them. So that's not very practical. And at the same time, we have another responsibility, and that's to provide for the use. The taxpayers that ultimately set this place aside. So that's another piece of it. The area, we very tightly control nesting habitat and stuff like that. It leaves very limited areas in some cases where vehicles can actually go by and do the recreation on the beach, for instance. So there's an interaction there that's becoming more and more difficult as there's less room to allow for sufficient distance between nests and people. We have to close it. And if you have to close it, then immediately the user groups start saying, "Hey, what's happened to all the beach we used to have?" So that can be impactful on the T&E species too. There's more people that'll want to break those barriers and go around and things like that. There's another thing that we're starting to see too. More fish and other species that were further down south are moving up here. Tiger shrimp. We used to never see any tiger shrimp, but we're getting tiger shrimp up here now. They're cool. They're giant, but things are changing, and how those impacts ultimately are going to impact the park are still in question. If we've seen a lot more whales lately. That's been kind of interesting. This used to be an area that whales were known for, but here in the last couple of years, I mean, we've had some pretty significant sightings of them. So it's a hard thing, and I have to admit, a lot of personal difficulty in dealing with these situations. Even when there are things that we can do, we have to ask the question, should we do them? Should we be moving those turtle nests? I mean, what's going on out there is a process, whether it's you attribute it, whatever you attribute it to, it doesn't matter. It's a process that's going on now, and certainly storm overwash has been occurring out on barrier islands for eons. So should we be moving turtle nests? There's a lot of ethical questions that we'll have to deal with as we continue to struggle with these the storms and the changes, the sea level rise that are occurring on these barrier islands, and it's got to be a part of everything that we do. We've got to be asking the question, what can we do, what should we do, and should we do it?
So, Jenny and Patrick, if you could summarize the report and talk a little bit about the challenges of preserving these natural ecosystems and cultural resources going forward will be, and what next steps are in place for further data collection.
Well, I suppose in summary, we looked at these three hazards with our models: flooding, groundwater depth, and shoreline position. And, like we spoke about in summary, with sea level rise and storms, we project that there will be increased flooding and loss of deep groundwater and further shoreline retreat. And the vertical land motion shows observations show us that the land sinking will affect the timing of when these occur. In the future, I think models are being developed more and more to include more complicated processes so that people can start to ask questions about how that morphology overall will change and how that can impact these hazards. You want to add to that, Patrick?
Yeah, I think it kind of presents a lot of challenges that Jeff has talked about, but perhaps even in spades moving forward. And, I think it helps kind of direct and hopefully support management decisions if they're looking at especially that more seaward part of the barrier of getting things out of the way, or thinking about how we're going to maybe move some of these things away from the more dynamic, exposed part of the coast of these barrier islands that are clearly going to be under more stress moving forward with sea level rise accelerating. So it's a challenge, but I think the more information we have to make informed decisions, and the more we understand how our collaborators at Park Service make decisions, we can get them hopefully more information that's useful so they can use their limited resources in the most effective way.
Any additional thoughts, Jeff?
Yeah, this is the key right here too. Absolutely. So, not only do we have the natural piece of Cape Lookout, but we've got all the infrastructure that's out there, right? How is that, impacted? How resilient is that infrastructure? What about the exposure it has already? Should that infrastructure be where it is? And one of the huge helps of studies like this is to help us answer those questions about infrastructure. Does it need to be moved? Do we even need that really? And if we don't, let's get rid of it. Because as we see what's happening out there, we are not smart people if we just keep doing the things that we've always done and expecting them to last.
Well, Jeff, Jenny, and Patrick, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Cape Lookout is really a fascinating place, and we look forward to learning more about the work that you guys are all doing there. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having us, Lynn.
Yeah, Lynn, really enjoyed it. Always do.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. Next week, barring any new developments in hiring freezes or deferred resignations in the National Park Service, we are planning to talk redwood forests with Greg King, the author of The Ghost Forest, a book that delves into the challenging history of saving California's redwood forests. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Rappencheck. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.